what I want to talk about in this video are three of the skills that go into the compression that is often an element in a narrative poem. There are loads of different kinds of narrative poems, and some of them are very fulsome. There are book-length narrative poems, obviously. Robinson Jeffers wrote several book-length narrative poems, of course, you know, in the 19th century, they were quite common when people had longer attention spans and probably a narrower cultural options for their source of narrative. They couldn't watch TV or look at their screens. But for contemporary narratives, compression seems to be an essential skill. And for poetry itself, Pound said that concentration is one of the essential characteristics of poetry. So the three skills of compression that I want to talk about are listed right here on this piece of paper. And they are omission, in other words, omission of much data, which still leaves the narrative intact; tone, which tells us how to interpret the data that remains in the poem; and narrative, which is always in the background of, or in the foreground of a narrative poem, or even, in fact, of a lyric poem. In some ways, this talk makes reference to the lecture or the essay by James Longenbach on compression, which some of you have read. And in that lecture, in that essay of James Longenbach's, he uses as an example a poem translated by Ezra Pound around the year 1908 from the Chinese. And the poem is in 3 lines, and I'm going to read the poem now. It's on your screen. It's called Fan Piece. It's written by a Chinese courtesan or wife or lover who has been abandoned, basically. Fan Piece. Oh, fan of white silk, clear as the frost on the grass blade, you also are laid aside. I'll read it again. Fan Piece. O fan of white silk, clear as frost on the grass blade, you also are laid aside. Okay. So we can see that this is an imagist poem. It's highly condensed. In Longenbach's essay, he also quotes, he also incorporates the text of the original translation from which Pound condensed this 3-line version. And the first translation, done by a late 19th century poet, is about 20 lines long. It's full of romantic gestures, and it tells, it's really sentimental, and it's really kind of overblown. So what Pound did was he essentially dehydrated it. He shrink wrapped it. He dried it out and dehydrated it into just 3 lines. And from those 3 lines, we are able to reconstitute the entire narrative. It's spoken in the voice of an abandoned woman who is addressing a fan. She's not addressing her ex-lover. She's not addressing the air. She's addressing this fan of white silk, which is clear as the frost on a grass blade. You also are laid aside. So the majority of the poem is operating on the grounds of inference or implication that comes from this minimalist representation of a narrative through tone. And we learn from the 3rd line that the lady has also identifies her feelings with the fan because she too has been laid aside. But there's great austerity and there's a great dignity. Okay, so first of all, we can admire the enormous amount of narrative, of tedious, burdensome narrative baggage that could have been in this poem, scene after scene, and it's all been omitted. It's all left up to our skill as readers and our acute ears to infer where this three-line exclamation comes from, what the narrative is in the background. And we can do that because the poem has so skillfully kept what is essential and omitted what is unnecessary. A very primary skill for all good poets. And that you spend an enormous amount of time in your apprenticeship learning what to cut out. We learn that in the revision process. There's probably no poem that you revise into a really good poem that has not been sort of radically dehydrated, radically cut away at, and left the essential. In fact, the difference between a very good poem and a pretty good poem or a mediocre poem is almost always a matter of volume and bulk of information. You know, the mediocre poet will almost always have more than is necessary for the poem. And the really skillful poet will be incredibly incisive and also extremely good at tone. The narrative is there in the background. This is not a narrative poem, it's a lyric poem. But in the background of every lyric poem is an implied narrative. It's like a jigsaw puzzle piece from which we can reconstitute or infer what the whole picture, the whole tableau is about. It's like just seeing the corner of an envelope and being able to understand the shape of the entire envelope and also the contents of the entire letter or the entire narrative that it's attached to. And that's really skill. So the narrative is there and it's in the background. The tone enables us to read through the slight information that is being given. And where is that tone? Well, we have three lines, and there's also the images. We learn a lot from the images too. But that tone can be reconstituted in a very particular way, I think, if we spend a lot of time sort of mulling over and meditating on it. The tone that is in the background of this poem, that is in the foreground of this poem, that enables us to reconstitute the narrative, is really one of sorrow and acceptance. Those two things. It's not just sorrow. It's not self-pity. It's sorrow and acceptance. Sorrow and the knowledge of a person of experience who has absorbed and digested the fact that she too has been laid aside, and that this is part of the transience of the world. What makes this poem larger than a mere wail, a mere shriek or keen of self-pity and grief, is the maturity, the emotional maturity of this tone. You know, you also are laid aside. You also are laid aside. Even the processional sophistication of the syntax in those third of those three lines is very sophisticated and shows somebody who has accepted, is moving at a slow pace as opposed to at a hysterical, speedy pace. The high point in tone, if we just want to talk about emotional intensity or rawness, is probably in the first syllable of the poem. Oh, fan of white silk. That may be the emotional peak of the poem. The second highest, most emotional peak of the poem is the word also. You know, we get a lot of information from that single word. So this is what happens when you're skillful at minimalism and at omission and at providing the minimal kinds of tonal clues and the minimal amount of narrative, is those little tiny ingredients. They register very, very audibly, very clear and very loud in terms of us understanding the full import of the narrative situation. This poem is really beautifully framed. There's one other thing that I would say you could learn from this poem, and that is really the beauty of the images. Oh, fan of white silk. Well, that's just a description of a fan that is lying on the table. We sort of see it, you know. She might be holding it in her hand, but you might see it on the table because it has been, after all, laid aside. But look at that second line of the poem. Fan of white silk, pale as the frost on a grass blade. Now that is a metaphor. Even though this is an imageless poem, it's got a metaphor in one line. Pale as the frost on a grass blade. So what has happened to that grass blade? That grass blade is being killed by the change in seasons. It's the frost has got it, and it's in its last phase of life. It's being frozen. It's frozen over. And so you see that there's a beautiful correlation of not one, but three images. One of them isn't really even in the frame. One is the lady, one is the fan of white silk, and the third image is the grass blade. And each one of them is part of an equation. Each one of them is reinforcing exactly the same tonalities and dimensions together. You know, the fan has been laid aside and is now in a state of disuse. Its life of being loved is over. The grass blade is going to die because of the change of seasons. And the lady, too, has accepted these facts of life about her particular situation. She also has been laid aside. So it's a wonderfully precise kind of tonality which enables us to reconstruct the narrative. Louise Glick, who is a sort of master of omission and compression, she has a really brilliant thing to say. She says the more information that is left out of a lyric poem, the more precise it must be, in the reader's mind as they read the poem. In other words, the more certain the reader must be about what has been left out. If the reader doesn't know quite what has been left out and has to sort of make stabbing guesses about it, then the poem is maybe a poem of the second water, not quite as good as it could be. But the more silence is in a poem, the more precisely the content of that silence is inferable. And that's why this is a beautiful example of compression, and in a certain kind of way, a model for many other narrative poems, where you can ask yourself, what is the tone here? What has been skillfully left out? How do I know so well exactly what has been left out? And why does it move me? Because of the skill of the tone, the skill of the omission, and I suppose the sort of drama that's been left out. In other words, the narrative. And that should be enough for this lesson.